Aloha, good morning. As people are joining us and logging in, please introduce yourself in the chat. Let other people know who's on so you can, since you can't see each other, that'll be a way to connect as well. Mahalo. And we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. We're just giving everyone a couple of minutes to get settled, to log in, test your system, say hello in the chat. It looks like more people are joining us. Thank you. Right. As we get settled, just please introduce yourself in the chat box. This is the Preservation and Practice in Hawaii seminar series sponsored by Historic Hawai Foundation. This is the, I believe, fourth webinar that we've done this year. We're excited to have everyone join us. So thank you all for being here. We have a really exciting program put together for us today, and really looking forward to hearing from all of our speakers. So again, I'm Kirsten Faulkner. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Hawaii Foundation. And this class is also being supported by our Education Program Manager, Andrea Nandoscar, with additional technical support by Michelle Kizik, our Development Assistant. For those who are new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit organization that helps people save historic places in the Hawaiian Islands. So we are today talking about preservation and conservation easements. Historic Hawaii Foundation holds 3 preservation easements on historic properties, among our other programs, which include advocacy, assistance, protection, and education. We are very pleased to partner with the Trust for Public Land, which is a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to conserving land for people. Leah Hong will be our presenter. She has been the Hawaii State Director for TPL since 2006. Leah previously chaired the Environmental and Cultural Resource Law Practice Group at the Honolulu law firm of Alston, Hunt, Floyd & Ng, which is now Denton. And she also worked for the Earth Justice Legal Defense Fund. Leah is a graduate of Lelehua High School, Rice University, and the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. She serves on the Friends of the Law School Board and has taught classes on environmental litigation, environmental regulatory compliance, and conservation transactions. Our second presenter is Laura Ka'akua, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of Hawaii Land Trust. Laura is a graduate of Punahou, Boston College, and the University of Hawaii William S. Richardson School of Law, where she received the Environmental Law Certificate. Laura also has extensive land conservation experience. Prior to joining HILT, she served 9 years as the Aloha Aina project manager at the Trust for Public Land. So welcome, Laura. We're also really excited to hear a case study that shows how conservation easements are applied to a working landscape. That will be presented by Michelle Galemba. The Galemba Ohana operates Kuahivi Ranch in Ka'u on Hawaii Island. Kuahivi Ranch has conservation and preservation easements that encumber lands that the ranch owns at Kavala. I'd like to note that this seminar has been submitted to the American Planning Association for 1.5 certificate maintenance credits for the American Institute of Certified Planners through a co-sponsorship and partnership with the APA Hawaii chapter. So we welcome and thank APA Hawaii as our partner and really thank them for supporting continuing education for planning professionals. We also have a new partnership with the Hawaii State Bar Association, which has approved this seminar for 1 CLE credit. To claim the credit, there are some administrative requirements that I'll go over now and remind you later, but at the end of this course, there will be a pop-up evaluation for everyone to complete. So, everyone please stay on and do that. And in the evaluation, there will be a section at the end that's specifically for attorneys. So for those of you who want the CLE credit, please enter your name, your bar association number, and your email address. So we'll use that along with the attendance record to track who was here and report that back to HSBA. And then we can also email your certificate of attendance to you. So this training will present an overview of the definitions, criteria, and considerations for using conservation and preservation easements to protect the intrinsic characteristics of special places. So this includes lands with natural, agricultural, and cultural values, and buildings with historic significance. We plan to take about 90 minutes. The program is being recorded. It will be available on the Historic Hawai Foundation website and YouTube channel. We will also post the slide deck, so you'll be able to download the images and notes afterwards as well. As we go through the presentations, please submit your questions through the Q&A or the chat button. And when we get to the panel discussion after the formal presentations, we'll answer as many of those as we can. We did set several learning objectives, especially for those of you who are getting continuing education credits through your professional organizations. So really, we're going to be covering the statutory, regulatory, and IRS requirements for conservation and historic preservation easements, with a focus on how easements assist with voluntary land conservation and historic preservation goals. We'll go over the purposes and types of conservation easements, the structure, the stipulations, and specific provisions that are recommended to meet those requirements. We wanted this to be practical, so we also want to talk about lessons learned, any pitfalls, any best practices that lawyers, planners, other professionals who are advising private landowners should really be aware of. And then those also apply to easement holding organizations. So community organizations or those who are advocating for perpetual preservation should also be aware of best practices. We'll talk about how to work with land trusts and historic preservation organizations to establish those easements. And then once the easements are in place, how they're maintained and monitored and how landowners can comply with those terms and stipulations. And then we also wanted to spend some time on financing and funding sources for easements, including tax credits, deductions, other kind of programs that are available to help make these possible. So we're going through all that in an hour and a half, where it's got a lot of information, but we're really excited about sharing it with all of you. So to get us started, I will turn it over to Leah and Laura. So welcome to both of you.
Mahalo, Kirsten, and mahalo to all of you for being with us this morning. And like Kirsten said, we have a lot to cover, so we'll launch right in. And we'll start with what is a conservation easement. A conservation easement is being shown right here in this picture. This is a beautiful photo of one of two lo'ikalo or wetland taro fields in Waioli and Hanalei, Kauai that are owned and were dedicated to conservation and traditional agriculture in perpetuity by Gaylord and Carol Wilcox. And they granted conservation easements to Hawaii Land Trust to make sure that these lands forever stay in lo'i. 'Kalo. 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 ' And so conservation easements are authorized under Hawaii state law. Chapter 198 defines a conservation easement. It's an interest in real property, the purpose of which is to protect and preserve natural open spaces, Native Hawaiian cultural landscapes, resources and sites, also to preserve historic properties and cemeteries, and lands used for agriculture. And possibly most importantly, conservation easements are voluntary. So it takes a commitment, a voluntary commitment from a willing landowner in order to use this legal tool to conserve land. So in short, a conservation easement is a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and either a land trust or government agency that permanently limits the use of the land in order to protect its agriculture or ranching or conservation values. It is a real property interest granted to that conservation easement holder, either the nonprofit or government agency. The name sometimes throws people off. So it's called a conservation easement or sometimes an agricultural easement, and you'll hear about historic preservation easements later from Kirsten. But it should not be confused with a road or utility or access easement or right of way. A conservation easement allows the landowner to retain many of his or her rights and also to pass it along to future generations. And so that makes it one appealing option to protect the property for future generations. So in Western property law, property rights are often described as a bundle of sticks. And this bundle of sticks provides many rights to landowners. And so each of these sticks represents one of those rights. Okay. And there are some rights which are not conveyed, they just run with the land and are protected under our Constitution, Native Hawaiian rights, some rights reserved to the state. And so what the conservation easement does is it allows a land trust and a landowner to have a conversation about which of these particular sticks in the bundle that landowner wants to transfer to the land trust and in effect extinguish. And so we might be working with a landowner who says, I never want to see this beautiful ranch subdivided. I always want to see it as a working ranch, 1 TMK. The landowner might say, I want to build one house for my grandson, and that's it. I don't want anyone in the future, 200 years from now, to be able to build more than that. A landowner might say, I want to enjoy my property, but I also want to give away the right to fully exclude others. So I want to create a coastal walking path that's open to the public. And so through this conversation, these sticks are then granted to the conservation easement holder and forever held in perpetuity through the conservation easement. So if the conservation easement is done, there's many benefits. One, it can be an effective tool to protect land. And also it's legally binding between the landowner and the land trust or government agency, but the landowner can still maintain many property rights since it's a tailored agreement for each parcel and for each landowner. If the conservation easement is donated, it may provide valuable tax benefits to landowners, and it allows landowners to keep their land in private ownership, but continuing to provide economic benefits to the area. The one thing we get asked a lot is that conservation easements do not automatically make properties open to the public. So as I was saying earlier, they're really tailored to that particular landowner's wishes and what's appropriate for that particular property.
Hi, I'm Leah Hong. As Laura previously mentioned, if donated, conservation easements may provide very valuable tax incentives to landowners. Landowners can deduct the value of a donated conservation easement as a charitable deduction. Under this very favorable treatment, they can deduct up to 50% of their adjusted gross income and carry forward the deduction for 15 years. And for qualifying farmers and ranchers who derive more than 50% of their income from farming or ranching activities, they can deduct up to 100% of their adjusted gross income and carry forward the deduction for 15 years. So this is very favorable treatment. The Internal Revenue Code outlines the requirements for qualifying for these favorable conservation easement tax incentives. The donation, which are essentially three elements: the donation or contribution of 1, a qualified real property interest; 2, a qualified organization; 4, 3, exclusively for conservation purposes. So let's break that down. First, a qualified real property interest is a perpetual restriction on the use of real property or land, essentially a preservation or a conservation easement. And we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the components of a conservation easement later in this presentation. Second, a qualified organization is very simply a government agency or a land trust or a historic preservation 501c3 tax-exempt organization. The conservation land trusts in Hawaii include the Trust for Public Land and the Hawaii Land Trust, both of which are nationally accredited land trusts. Other land trusts in Hawaii are listed in the slide. Collectively, the land trusts in Hawaii have conserved over 275,000 acres of land through outright acquisition or donation or through conservation easements. Other qualified organizations that hold conservation easements in Hawaii include organizations like Livable Hawaii Kaihui, which co-holds a conservation easement with the city and county of Honolulu over a very small property in East Honolulu known as Kanewai Spring, owned by the Maunalua Fishpond Heritage Center, which uses the property for Aina-based education and marine habitat conservation. The Alakakai Trail Association is a nonprofit on Hawaii Island. It's another example of a qualified organization, and it holds 2 conservation easements on land owned by Kuahiwi Ranch at Kawala, which Michelle Galemba will talk about later in this presentation.
So a third requirement under the Internal Revenue Code is that the conservation easement must be exclusively for conservation purposes. So these purposes include outdoor recreation or education, natural habitat, open space. So open space can include farmland and also forest land for the scenic enjoyment of the general public, or consistent with government policy yielding significant public benefit, and also preservation of a historically important land area or certified historic structure. So some examples of conservation easements in Hawaii, we'll just run through quickly. A recent conservation easement was put over Lo'ikalo traditional wetland taro fields in Hakipu'u on the east side of Oahu. And the conservation purposes there are to preserve the historic lo'i and also to allow for Aina-based education. The landowner is a local nonprofit, and the conservation easement holder is Hawaii Land Trust in the city and county of Honolulu. Also on Oahu, Haweaheao and Keawa'awa wetlands, the landowner is a local nonprofit, Livable Hawaii Kaihui. The conservation easement holder is the city and county of Honolulu. And as the pictures show, the purposes here were really to protect the endangered waterbird habitat, as well as the many significant cultural sites that are there on this property in Mauna Lua, also known as Hawaii Kai. And then moving to Hawaii Island, an example of a conservation easement is the one over the Honolulu Coffee Company's coffee farmland in Kealakekua. Hawaii Land Trust is the holder of that conservation easement to protect those agricultural and native forest values. And some more examples. The top row of photos is aerial image, so you can get a sense of the varying shapes and sizes of these conservation easements. The conservation easement could be applied to the entire TMK parcel, or it could be crafted so that it applies to only a section of the parcel. So the first example here, we're looking at conservation easement to protect the agricultural values of a macadamia nut farm on Hawaii Island. The second example in the middle two pictures is of Keopuka on the Kona coast. The purpose of this conservation easement is to protect many cultural sites along the coastline, as well as the coastline itself, which is an important fishing grounds and traditional landscape. And so in this example, it's owned by a private company. And then our third column here shows Havea Point on Maui. And the purpose of this conservation easement is twofold. One, it provides public coastal access following this line that you're looking at. And two, it also protects endangered habitat. And all of these are held by Hawaii Land Trust.
So we've talked about the internal revenue code requirements for obtaining a conservation easement tax deduction. And a key part of qualifying for the deduction is the appraised value of the conservation easement. If a landowner wants to take advantage of the conservation easement tax incentive, the landowner must retain an experienced, qualified appraiser who's familiar with appraising conservation easements and providing documentation for the conservation easement deductions. The expense of the conservation easement appraisal will be higher, as it is two appraisals in one: an appraisal of the value of the unencumbered fee simple value of the property, and a second appraisal of the value of the property encumbered with the conservation easement. So essentially, the equation is the unencumbered fee value minus the encumbered value equals the conservation easement value. So remember what Laura talked about, the bundle of sticks. The conservation easement appraisal is merely placing a value or estimating a value on the sticks that have been removed from the landowner's bundle of sticks by the conservation easement. So we also wanted to highlight for you the U.S. Treasury regulations and also the IRS Form 8283. We're not going to go through those regulations because they're pretty detailed, but we just wanted to point out as a matter of practice that IRS Form 8283 requires the signature both of the donee, the land trust or historic preservation organization, and the appraiser, and that in the appraiser's acknowledgement, he or she must certify that he or she is qualified to appraise conservation easements, and that a false or fraudulent overstatement of value could subject the appraiser to substantial penalties. So this is sort of a serious undertaking for the appraiser and not to be taken lightly. Next slide. So lands under a conservation easement can be enrolled in agricultural or native forest types of dedications that are available, at the county real property tax assessor's office. Those kinds of dedications can substantially decrease real property taxes. Often those types of dedications are more favorable than trying to reduce the base value of the real property tax assessed value. But, essentially, county real property tax assessors should reduce the value of property burden with conservation easements and can be provided with the appraisal and the backup for that. But as a practical matter, most landowners find that entering their land into the agricultural or native forest or other kind of dedication actually results in better tax treatment than reducing the base value of the real property tax assessed value. So there are a number of mainland states, 14, that provide state tax credits for conservation easement donations, but Hawaii is not among them.
So the conservation easement will always have a similar structure. So the specific provisions can be vastly different depending on the conservation values to be protected and the landowner's wishes, and also the grantee or the conservation easement holder. But the general outline of the conservation easement document will follow a similar structure. So at the top, we'll typically have a number of whereas clauses that set the context for any future owner, because as we said earlier, when a conservation easement is placed on a property, the underlying fee can still be transferred and the conservation easement runs with the land. So we want to make sure that someone picking up the document in 200 years can understand why the parties came together in the first place and the conservation values that drew everyone to work on this document. Then there's the actual language granting the conservation easement, noting that it is a perpetual grant to the conservation easement holder. Then there's a section on the conservation easement restrictions. And this is really just a summary of all of the sticks being taken away, which will look vastly different depending on the landowner's wishes. And then there's a section where it outlines the rights of the grantor or landowner that they're retaining. So rights to sell, pass to heirs, if they do not want to invite the public in, the right of privacy and quiet enjoyment, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a section on the rights of grantee or conservation easement holder. The conservation easement holder will always have the right to enforce. And as accredited land trusts, we are required to enforce the terms of the conservation easement in order to uphold our accreditation. We have the right to enter the property for monitoring, and there's conditions around that. And typically it's a really friendly process of coming in once a year, taking a walk together along the property. And then there's a section on the general provisions, things that you'll find in almost every conservation easement. And then attachments, which might be the maps. It might note certain sections for different purposes. Maybe there's a section that its conservation values are to preserve native forests. Maybe there's a section where its conservation values are to preserve a public walking trail. And so you'll have the maps, which will be very helpful now and in the future.
So conservation easements can be donated, resulting in substantial tax benefits for landowners, but landowners can also be paid or compensated by selling conservation easements to public agencies or land trusts. So federal funding sources for conservation easements include the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which derives its money from offshore oil drilling lease revenues. This source of funding funds things like park expansions or agency, BLM, U.S. Forest Service expansions, but it also funds programs that can fund conservation easements, including U.S. Fish and Wildlife programs, U.S. Forest Service programs, and coastal programs. There's also a source of funding under the Department of Defense called the Readiness Environmental Protection Integration or Buffer Program. This source of funding has helped to conserve many properties on Oahu, especially around the North Shore and the training areas, Akahuku and Schofield Barracks. And there are also sources of funding through the Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, which conserves not only agricultural land, but also ranch land and wetlands as well. And I did want to note that because of the efforts of many organizations last year, in a bipartisan bill, Congress did pass the Great American Outdoors Act, which fully funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund for the first time in its long history, meaning that $900 million a year goes into this fund. And as a result, funding for many of these programs has doubled or even more. So there is more opportunity to tap these funds. And then most recently, the president's budget bill proposed increasing funding for the REPI or buffer program to $150 million, which is the most it ever has received. But tapping these funds is not simple. It's very difficult. It requires participation of a land trust partner, government agencies, and it takes a very long time. So compensated conservation easements probably take a minimum of 2 to 3, if not more years to secure funding like this. Next slide.
Leah shared the great resources at the federal level, and we should also be really proud locally. We're only one of 2 states that has enacted land conservation funding sources at the state and all county levels. So at the state level, there's the State Legacy Land Conservation Program. It's funded by 10% of the real estate conveyance tax, up to approximately $5 to $6 million a year going into the pot of money. It's administered by the Legacy Land Conservation Commission via open application. It's a very transparent process. The funds are approved by BLNR and released by the governor, administered under DOFA of DLNR. And it's a highly competitive process. So you have groups and agencies from all islands competing in a friendly way. Really, everyone's trying to support one another, but there is a limited amount of money there. And I will say we've seen most of the funds go to support acquisitions, and with some of the funds going to support conservation easements as well. At the county levels, this is a list of all of the county programs. The city and county has the Honolulu Clean Water and Natural Lands Fund, 0.5% of real property taxes. The Maui Open Space Fund is 1% of real property taxes. Hawaii has a similar fund. These are really all sister funds. That's 0.5% of real property taxes. And the Hawaii County Public Access Open Space Natural Resources Preservation Fund is 2% of real property taxes. And Hawaii County has another fund just for stewardship of the lands once protected. And so these are all, like Leah said, they're all great programs, and it also takes a long time to move projects through. There's often a lot of community support that is needed, as well as a really impassioned community group or working with a land trust partner or government agency partner to move these projects through the commission review process, as well as up to the various levels of government, whether at the county council or the mayor's office or the governor's office for state funds.
So two examples of compensated conservation easements include the Malka and Mackay land around the Turtle Bay Resort on Oahu's North Shore. The Mackay or ocean side of the land owned by the resort includes Cavella Bay, which is shown in this slide. So the Turtle Bay Resort owned about 2,000 acres of land surrounding the existing resort, which is kind of in the center of this map. And the land that they owned included land Mackay or ocean side of Kamehameha Highway, and then land also Malka or towards the mountains of Kamehameha Highway. So on its Mackay property, the resort had obtained entitlements to build 5 additional hotels and over 2,000 condominium units. The Mackay Conservation Project, which I guess next slide, or actually let's stay on this slide. The Mackay Conservation Project actually conserved about 634 acres of land. 569 acres are under a conservation easement owned by the state in the light orange or salmon color. 52.5 acres are owned in fee by the state with a lease back to the resort for a nominal rent. And that's in the dark orange on the left side of the map at Cavella Bay. And there are 12.5 acres owned in fee by the city with a similar lease back on the yellow side, sort of goldenrod, I guess, on the left side of the map at Cavella Bay. In addition, the conservation project included 8 miles of trails open to the public and the dotted sort of green lines, 80 public parking stalls, which doubled the previous requirements, free golf for the Kahuku Golf high school team, and 100 to 150 foot shoreline setbacks. So the conservation easement reduced the number of hotels from 5 to 2. The 2 hotel sites are immediately adjacent to and on the either side of the existing hotel, reducing the hotel footprint substantially. And the conservation easement also reduced the number of allowed condominium units from over 2,000 to 725. Next slide. So the landowner of the resort was paid a total of $45 million, the sources of which were state general obligation bonds, the debt service of which is paid partially by the transient accommodation tax and the Legacy Land Conservation Fund, the City and County of Honolulu's Clean Water and Natural Lands Program, and the Department of Defense REPI Buffer Program. So from inception to closing, this project spanned the terms of 3 mayors and 3 governors. So it was by no means a simple feat. It took quite a long time, probably over 10 to 12 years. And in a separate transaction, the resort also sold a conservation easement, an agricultural conservation easement for $6 million over its 468 acres of Malka agricultural lands, funded through the City and County of Honolulu's Clean Water and Natural Lands Program, the State Legacy Land Conservation Program, and the Department of Defense REPI Program. The CE is held by the North Shore Community Land Trust and was facilitated by the Trust for Public Land, which has a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Army Garrison Hawaii under the REPI program. The land is dedicated to agricultural uses in perpetuity with a reservation of about 5 acres for farm worker housing. And this property in particular is adjacent to the Army's Kahuku training area.
So things that you should think about when working with land trusts or historic preservation organizations to establish easements. First, we want you to know that land trusts and historic preservation organizations are reliable partners, and also a wealth of information on easement. So we often will just give advice to folks if they're interested in talking through a potential easement, and have a good working relationship with the whole land trust community, as well as Historic Hawaii Foundation, to bring in other partners as needed, as may be helpful to a particular landowner. The land trust will lead public funding efforts if it's not a donated easement. If the landowner wishes to sell that easement and the land trust believes we can raise funds for that, we will take the lead in identifying funding sources, and oftentimes, as Leah shared in the Kahuku example, compiling various funding sources to meet the appraised fair market value. Also, we want you to know that stewardship and enforcement endowment donations are always asked of the landowner at closing. So really, these projects most thankfully do not take the 10 to 12 years that it took to complete Leah's Cabela Bay project, but they do often take a long time and require dedicated staff who can really shepherd the entire project from that first conversation with the landowner to recording the conservation easement and closing escrow. And so we always do ask for support as nonprofit organizations doing this work. Also, each organization, land trust or Historic Hawaii Foundation, will have their own internal approval processes. And a lot of times what the organizational board will look for is to make sure that the type of conservation values that a particular project protects match up with that organization's strategic land protection priorities, and that the organization has the bandwidth and financial capacity moving forward to steward that conservation easement into perpetuity. It's also important to note that as nonprofit organizations, we can only pay the appraised fair market value for a compensated easement. And as you've already heard, the timeline is usually long, longer than the landowner would often like, and typically longer than we would like as well, especially for conservation easements that are compensated. And so once you've actually gone through with the process of working with a land trust or Historic Hawaii Foundation to do an easement on your property, we then have the responsibility to annually monitor and create monitoring reports to make sure that the terms of the conservation easement or historic preservation easement are being followed. So the image that you see on your screen is of Ulupalakua Ranch. And the ranch has made a tremendous commitment to conservation in doing a number of conservation easements with Hawaii Land Trust that protect over 11,000 acres of land on Maui. And so we're looking at each of those dots are different photos that we take, photo spots that we're going to be, we have been documenting every single year. And so you can see in the little inset photos, just comparison over time of the same parts of the property. So we use a number of technologies to help us in monitoring. With the landowner's permission, we can use drone aerial imagery and flyovers. We use high resolution aerial pictometry. And of course, nothing beats just getting to walk the property every year with a rancher, a landowner, and just talk through any issues that they may be having. So some things to keep in mind. We want to make sure that as a land trust holding a conservation easement, we're always there to address any questions or concerns or upcoming issues or problems that a landowner might be facing. They might have questions about whether something that they want to do on their property is allowed under the conservation easement. And so we always want to welcome those conversations and really work through it together. And then we document this annual visit and results in writing for all parties. We address any corrective actions or remediation needed, which is unusual, but it does happen. And then we meet any new staff or owners or agents who may have come on since the past year and just bring them up to speed. So there's some best practices on complying with conservation easements. We always advise landowners to have their own counsel before signing a conservation easement and to involve the next generations. If that landowner is planning on passing it on within their family, to make sure that that next generation can work with the terms of the conservation easement as anticipated. And then once recorded, we note that we want the conservation easement holder to really review that final document as just a best practice with the whole landowner entity. So people will have been working on this project usually for a couple years, and once it's all said and done, we don't just want to leave it there. We really want to review, make sure that everyone understands. And so that's sometimes when maybe the head of a farm or ranch will sit everyone down and have them walk through the terms of the conservation easement with the conservation easement holder. We always ask that someone join our annual monitoring walkthroughs just to stay in contact, answer any questions. If in doubt, ask the conservation easement holder. It's always a best practice to tell the conservation easement holder if you plan to sell, and then to connect the land trust with the new buyer owner so that we can review the terms of the conservation easement with them.
So apologies for my dog, but some other pitfalls and issues to be aware of. Again, perpetuity is forever. That's a long time. And amending a conservation or preservation easement once it's been recorded is very, very difficult. So it would behoove the landowner and the landowner's family to really sit down and think about what the uses are of the property in the future, plan ahead and include all potential landowner uses for the future. I know when Michelle Galemba's family was considering putting a conservation easement on their property, you know, they excluded some properties that they felt might have more sort of, you know, activity and building upon. And so these are questions that your family and company need to consider very seriously. Donating a conservation easement can be expensive. Conservation easements, donations, they can result in favorable tax treatment, but anticipate the legal expenses and other expenses, appraisal, environmental phase 1, perhaps, survey, baseline monitoring report, and a stewardship and enforcement endowment to the land trust. So you have to sort of weigh that calculation as to the benefit of the tax deduction and the relative expenses. Be aware that deductions for donated easements can trigger IRS scrutiny or an audit. Conservation easements must be documented properly. And then timing, it will take longer than you expect. You need to plan well in advance to ensure closing in the chosen tax year that you're seeking favorable tax treatment. If you are seeking compensation from a public or government program, you need to plan, you know, like I said before, 2 to 3 or more years to complete that project. And then land is a sensitive topic in Hawaii. You know, many people do not understand conservation easements. They don't understand why there are government programs that provide landowner incentives for restricting their land. And you know, some people will say, oh, why are we paying someone not to develop this land? And, you know, the history of Hawaii's land can really raise a lot of sensitive subjects and spark a lot of discussion. So now we get to the really interesting part where we get to talk to an actual landowner who has been through the process of putting a conservation easement on 2 of her properties and who is working on a 3rd conservation easement on another of her properties with the Trust for Public Land and the Alakakai Trail Association. I'm very pleased to introduce Michelle Galemba, one of the owners of Kuahibi Ranch, which operates a grass-fed beef operation on Hawaii Island in Ka'u.
Thank you, Leah. So yes, aloha. My name is Michelle Galemba, and along with my family, we operate Kuahibi Ranch. I grew up in Ka'u, and my family has been in agriculture for quite some time. We moved to Honolulu actually for about 10 years, from 1976 to 1986, and then moved back to Ka'u in the late 80s. And we actually started our ranch in 1993. And we started it literally with like 1 cow and 1 pasture. And we've slowly grown the ranch since that time, since 1993. For the first 10 years, all of the acreage that we used for our ranch was short term. It was year to year or even month to month leases. So as we sort of slowly built up our ranch, we were always kind of wanting to get to a place where we could have more long-term tenure. Because that just allows you to invest in your ranch and just be a better operation and just have that psychological, feeling that of security of having long-term tenure. Let's see as we've built up the ranch, we do have the capacity now to get credit to buy some of the land that we've been leasing. But agriculture and ranching is it's not something that you make a whole lot of money on. So we have to be really careful not to over leverage. So that with the CEs that we're getting, which are compensated CEs, these conservation easements help us to get the long-term tenure to actually own the land, but not to sort of get ourselves into such trouble by having large loans on pasture. So that's sort of like the really dollars and cents way that conservation easements help us. But I think even more importantly, and you can go to the next slide, please. Even more importantly, I think growing up in Ka'u, as a family, and I think even as a community, we have this passion for our landscape. And this is a picture of a rock wall on the Kavala piece, which is our first conservation easement. And it's just one of many, dry stack rock walls that are on the property. There's also burial caves, heiau, other kinds of cultural resources. So that preserving that landscape and just the open space of Ka'u is something that my family feels really strongly about. So I think sort of when you have those 2 elements working together of the compensation for our being able to use it for agriculture and perpetuity, which is what we want, and this passion for open space. The conservation easement really makes a lot of sense. And you can go to the next slide. So we have, as Leah mentioned, 3 conservation projects. The first one is Kavala. The second is Manaka, which is right below it. And then right now we're working on the third, Honawapo. So the team that worked on these conservation easements included TPL, which Leah and actually Laura Kaakua, who actually was with TPL when we started out on the Kavala project, and was succeeded by Reina Ramoleta. Keone Fox with Alakahakai Trail Association. And then Jean Campbell, who was my counsel, who was at Bays Lung, Rose, and Homa at the time, but has since moved to being Corporation Counsel of the County of Hawaii. So that was the team. And I just want to sort of talk about, the larger context. You can see in purple that there's other projects on the Ka'u coast, and the same team or parts of the same team have been working to also preserve those parcels in purple. Right, so it's sort of like a landscape that we're trying to preserve, and I'm just like so grateful to be part of this team and part of this effort to preserve this really beautiful landscape out here in Ka'u. We can move on to the next slide. So this is just a picture of actually my daughter and my niece and working on the ranch. So, this is actually on the borderline of Kavala and Manaka'a. So it's a working ranch, and as Leah pointed out, like the next generation is so important. I mean, conservation easement is forever, but the next generation is pretty much as much as we're able to really work with, and hopefully that they'll pass this sort of values on, and we'll actually probably be better at working with a conservation easement than I am, since this is really just a new project for us. And I just wanted to say that about this land, actually it's been in cattle for a really long time. It was part of Princess Ruth's ranch, Ka'alu'alu Ranch back in the kingdom. So yes, the next slide is the timeline for our first conservation easement. And so we purchased the property in July of 2018. And we were already, before we purchased it, thinking about a conservation easement. But it wasn't until we actually purchased it that we could get working on actually drafting the conservation easement. So we started that in, probably early 2019, and it took us a year or more, probably a year and a half really, to get it done. So the CE closed on January 1st, 2020. And it was difficult because we were sort of having to, make a custom conservation easement. We looked at several models, sort of previous conservation easements in Hawaii, and also we looked at the there's sort of a template for agricultural conservation easement from the NRCS ASEP program. So we kind of used elements from that. And so we still have some elements of that conservation easement that are outstanding. And that's the reason they're outstanding is because we just keep doing new conservation easements. So we need to get back to that and really sort of get some of those things, the agricultural plan, the cultural resource plan, and our fire plan, get those done. So even though after you've recorded a conservation easement, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely done unless you get everything done before recording. So it's kind of an ongoing process. And we can go on to the next slide. So this is just a photo of, this is Kavala looking Melka. And these are my ranch dogs enjoying the water trough. And this water trough is, I love these water troughs because they're concrete and they were poured in place in the 1930s. So it's kind of, just for me, just kind of amazing thinking about, you know, cowboys putting these water troughs in the 1930s. You can turn to the next slide. So yeah, this is some of the considerations before starting a CE project from my perspective. As a landowner and rancher, so like the first thing really is just trying to get your head around forever, which, you know, you realize that you can't really, but you can do your best and try to think out, you know, 50 to 100 years if you can, to the best of your processing abilities. But the really important thing is to get that next generation, make sure that they're committed to it. And then also really important is like that it fit with your community and your community's vision, which is really the case here in Ka'u on our ranch. We did do a community development plan here in Ka'u, starting in 2008, and it took us about 8 years to get it done. But the feedback from the community was very strong about preserving open space. So I feel like our conservation easement fulfills the community's vision, which I think is, you know, really important. And then flexibility is, you know, again, it's forever. So you're trying to think out in the future and really balancing as much flexibility as you can, looking forward for your family, for your community, what might they need, and balancing that with your desire for conserving what is really important as far as conservation values. The costs is really important. You need to try and, you know, get an estimate of what the costs will be. You're going to have legal, appraisal, surveying costs. So those it's and also the donation to the CE holding organization. So those costs can be significant, but at least in my case, they're definitely outweighed by the, you know, the benefit that we could get from this conservation easement. And the other point, which previous presenters made about capacity, is really important. You know, you need to have groups that hopefully will have the capacity going forward in that perpetual time frame, and, you know, have the willingness to honor the conservation easement. Next slide. So this is just some pictures. This is Mauna Kea looking towards the east, towards the Hawaii Volcano National Park. It's a really excellent ranch land, grassland down by the coast. That is the High Trail does run along the coastline, so there's that sort of trail element, and then also, of course, there's the cultural resources. So, and then the shoreline protection, which is something I hadn't really talked about. This is part of protecting the shoreline because that ocean out there is really rich in marine resources. So preserving the coastline is something that our community is really passionate about. We can go to the next slide. So this is a picture of the Honuapo land, looking again to the east. And you can see my horse's ears there in the bottom, taking a picture from on top of a horse. They always put their ears in. You can go on to the next slide. This is, again, the same Honuapo ranch lands, and this is from the shoreline looking Mauka at the ranch land. And we can move on to the next slide. So I just wanted to finish up with, some pros and cons. It's really a lot of what has previously been said, which is sort of from my perspective as a rancher. It's, I think, a really effective tool to preserve landscapes and conserve natural resources. I really want to make sure and sort of almost handcuff my successors to keeping that landscape open and agricultural and preserving cultural resources and the shoreline. It can help us as farmers and ranchers to defray the cost of land acquisition for agriculture and making sure that we can, produce food in Hawaii, which I think the pandemic really showed us is something that we really need to work on, so that we have more food security. And again, it can align the community values with our private landowner interests in a way that's like very much a win-win for everybody. The con side, developing the grant of conservation easement can take quite a bit of time, even under the best circumstances. And I feel like, I kind of had a really great team, everybody really wanting to work together and move it forward. So, even then it took quite a bit of time. It definitely does reduce the potential uses of the land. You can't develop it ever. So in some ways, development values are going to go up in time. So in some ways, you really have to be at peace with that, that sort of financial calculus. And then again, excellent communication between the multiple stakeholders over a very long time horizon. That's just something, I don't know if it's a con, but it's definitely something that needs to be worked on and that I'm working on actively as we sort of grow into this conservation easement relationship with the conservation easement holder. I guess that's all for me for now, and I'm going to pass it on over to Kirsten. Thanks very much.
Aloha, everyone. I'm not sure if we're maybe having Kirsten may be having technical difficulties. This is Andrea. Let me just double check. Thanks so much for your patience.
Andrea, is my audio working now?
Yes, you're good. You're good. I can see you and your audio is working.
Okay, I apologize. I didn't hit all the buttons. So sorry about that, everyone. Basically, we wanted to flow into how conservation easements apply to qualified historic properties as well as land and sites. And as you think back on what the different purposes are for conservation easements, one of them is the perpetual preservation of historic properties. So the legal structure and enabling legislation is the same as the conservation easements for land and sites. They provide strong, lasting legal protection for historic properties through that same enforceable legal commitment. Again, these are voluntarily made by the property owner and are binding on all subsequent owners. When we talk about a qualified historic property, that means that these are properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And that can be either individually listed or as a contributing building in a historic district. So this example is on Maui. It's the Fred Baldwin Memorial Home. Historic Hawai Foundation holds the easement on this. This is the oldest wooden institutional building on the island. It's over 100 years old. It was originally called the Old Men's Home and was the first senior living facility for retirees from the sugar plantations. Later, it was a dormitory for pineapple field workers, and then a barracks during World War II. It was a convent and nunnery. Now it's being used as a retreat center that's run as Lumeria Maui. It consists of 5 connected buildings, an interior courtyard, and just over 3 acres of land that are encumbered by the preservation easement. So again, it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and this easement provides that perpetual preservation for this property. The historic preservation easements are very similar to the outline that Laura described for conservation easements, but it has some additional components as well. There's entire sections that look at what kinds of activities could occur, potentially, that bundle of sticks, and divides them up into those that are prohibited, conditional, or permitted or reserved by the landowner. The prohibitions are always against demolition of the historic property. The whole purpose here is to preserve it in perpetuity. So demolition, relocation, raising it, but also certain kinds of additions are simply not allowed in that conservation area. You want to preserve the form, the mass, the view sheds, and so forth. There are also conditional uses that can be allowed if they're consistent with the terms, if they meet the standards, and if they're have the prior approval of the easement holder. And then the permitted without any further review are basically all the other rights in that bundle. So the use, enjoyment, exclusion of others, those basic property rights would be retained by the owner. The easement can also outline other provisions, including potential land uses or public or specific visitation, temporary uses, that sort of thing. So in this example, we have the Jean and Zoma Charlot house, which is a single family residence that was designed and occupied by the artist Jean Charlot, who was an incredibly prominent artist in the mid-20th century, who's also an art professor at the University of Hawaii. So after Mr. Charlot and his wife passed away, the family decided to donate the home to the university, and it came with the condition that the university then donate the preservation easement to Historic Hawai Foundation. And that easement allows for it to be used as a home, and they do often use it for visiting faculty or for a caretaker, but it also allows it to be used for educational and cultural purposes. This is an amazing property associated with this prominent artist, and so the study of his art, the study of the mid-century modern design motif, for the use of materials, for the conservation materials, so forth. The easement also has very strong restrictions against commercial uses and specifically calls out the studio that can only be used as a studio. For example, it couldn't be converted to a bedroom in the future. Other provisions include certain types of public access for the study of architecture, art, material conservation. But the Charlot family also reserved certain visitation rights. They wanted to have the ability to have family reunions and introduce future generations of the family to this important part of their family history. So they reserve some of those visitation rights. And all of that is spelled out. The easement terms have to define which parts of the property are subject to those restrictions. When we're talking about a historic building, we're looking at what makes it historic and what are the characteristics that reflect that significance. It can include, of course, the bulk, the mass, the exterior, the siding, but also view sheds, the landscape, the archaeological features, the interior. Maybe there's some special craftsmanship or artwork or something that really is part of that intrinsic quality. This example is the Dearborn building on Ward Avenue in Kaka'ako. It was built in the 1920s for the Dearborn Chemical Company as a distribution and warehouse, basically, that was later converted into smaller retail spaces. It was known as the Universal Building. So this project restored not only the exterior, but also this singular open space on the interior, and it's now a Patagonia store. So key features that are protected by the easement include the overall form, the massing, the materials, the windows, the doors, but it also protects some of the interior features like this kind of amazing roof truss system that's exposed to view and that open floor plan. So when we do this, we need to have really good baseline documentation to do that upfront identification of the historic significance and the characteristics that contribute or do not to that significance. And just like land conservation easements, we have annual monitoring and inspections that ensures everyone stays aware, they're compliant with all the terms, and that we have those lines of communication that are open to address questions or concerns before they become problems. So here's some of the typical sections and stipulations that are included in the easements. These whereas clauses and recitals are really important. We talked about that earlier when you're talking about forever, going back and having a really good administrative record about who did what and why and what are we trying to protect and what is the designation status and what are the different features, and some work may be pre-approved. We might want to make sure that that is well documented as well. Then the grant of the easement itself, we always have a section that says, what are we trying to do? What is our purpose? Which is to assure that the property's conservation and preservation values will be retained and maintained in substantially the same condition. We also have affirmative responsibilities that might be spelled out. So not just what you won't do, but what you will. And so the landowners have this obligation to repair and maintain and not let the property decay or degrade over time. There'll be the prohibited activities against demolition or redevelopment, conditional rights that include the process for the request and the standards for the review. And then if public access is required, what that means. Usually that includes visual access from the exterior, but it might include access for other purposes as well. The easement will spell out the permitted rights and activities that do not require permission, and various administrative sections on insurance, emergencies, notice, remedies, that sort of thing. A key provision addresses the binding effect, and that the easement can only be extinguished in extraordinary circumstances. Usually that means a court order or as a result of a government eminent domain action, if they, put a highway through the middle of the property or something like that. But otherwise, these, last forever. But we will have some provisions to address amendment procedures and also assignment to a new easement holder in the event that the original entity either ceases to exist or cannot perform its obligations. So to take into account that flexibility over the long term as well. And finally, the exhibits are very important. The easement itself might run, 8-10 pages, and the exhibits can go to many hundreds. When you have the baseline documentation, the maps, the photos, the historic property documentation, the drawings, the specifications, all of that. We did want to note a current legal and legislative issue that's related to curbing some types of fraud that have been associated with bad actors. This Charitable Conservation and Easement Program Integrity Act was introduced in both the 115th and 116th Congress, and it's really gained some considerable support to address specific ongoing abuses in donation of preservation and conservation easements. So the issue here is the IRS noted that certain types of syndicated transactions were subject to abuse. And really, legitimate easement holding organizations support the passage of this bill. We think it will really help ensure that this tax incentive remains available for genuine philanthropists and conservation and preservation communities while helping to curb some of the more egregious actions. The issue is that the IRS, or the Internal Revenue Code, permits taxpayers to take that tax deduction for the donation of a conservation easement. And there's a type of syndication that can occur when a legal partnership or other pass-through entity is created. And then investors contribute capital to that pass-through entity, and then the pass-through entity donates the easement to the tax-exempt entity. And the tax deduction is allocated back to those pass-through entities' investors. So while most easement transactions really do fill that public policy objective, some promoters have used these kind of transactions to offer investors the opportunity to claim tax deductions that really exceeded the amount that they invested. And the IRS are calling them on it. They said, you know, these deductions are based on appraisals that inflated the value of the easement based on unreasonable conclusions. And so they did some assessment and said, you know, this isn't going to work. And so in 2019, the IRS listed these easement syndication transactions in their annual Dirty Dozen list of tax scams to avoid. So this bill and this crackdown at the IRS is aimed at curbing the abuse. And really, by doing that, ensuring that the tax incentive remains available for genuine supporters in the land conservation and historic preservation communities. So the donations of easements will continue to receive scrutiny, regardless of whether they're syndicated or not. And so we really recommend that all land trust preservation organizations follow the best practices when accepting any donation of an easement. The Land Trust Alliance has standards and practices. They provide accreditation to land trusts. Both HILT and TPL are accredited organizations. And preservation organizations like Historic Hawai Foundation can adopt, and we have adopted, those standards and practices. And, you know, this isn't to scare anyone off. It's just to make you aware that there are really best practices that need to be followed. So finally, just to reaffirm some of the recommendations and lessons learned, all the easements need to be individually tailored to protect the specific features of the property. So for historic buildings, that means the entire building, including the roof line, the side, the facades, any significant features of the landscape, or particular examples of craftsmanship. This example from the Charlot House includes numerous examples of integrated artwork, such as, you know, these ceramic tiles. There's a large fresco that's sort of just off the photo here, but they're specifically called out for special protection. Record keeping is really important, especially as easements often have provisions for approved modifications that must be documented over time. So again, in this example, this property is on the edge of a channelized stream, and it's very close to the ocean. It's vulnerable to flooding. Whoops, went too far, sorry. So we're looking at some potential modifications to protect it and provide that resilience. And we'll need to document all of that, of course. And then I really encourage people who are considering donating easements or working with land trust and preservation organizations to consider the capacity and qualifications of that easement holding organization. Make sure that it has the ability to monitor and enforce the provisions and has a program of responsible stewardship. So with that, I'm going to invite all of our panelists to come back, and we will take a few minutes. I think I have about 5, maybe 8 minutes to answer a couple of questions. So let me just start with a question to everyone of, if a property owner is interested in pursuing a conservation or preservation easement, what's their first step? What should they really be looking at first? So I'll just, let's see, Laura, let's start with you.
Yeah, and my answer pretty much puts it back on everyone. I think the way we work as the land trust community in Hawaii, including in partnership with Historic Hawai Foundation, is we would just recommend folks to reach out to one of our offices. If it's a historic building that you're really interested in, I would start with Historic Hawai Foundation. If it's a conservation easement, I think you could call either Hawaii Land Trust or the Trust for Public Land, and between our two organizations, we can figure out, who might be best able to help. We do work in partnership a lot. And so sometimes for larger projects, we'll work together on those particular easements.
Yeah, I would say that landowners considering this really need to talk with their, either family or board or whoever is sort of the deciders for the future of the property, because that can often lead to conflict. You really want to have everyone on board when you're going to restrict land in perpetuity. And so you don't want to waste too much of the land trust or historic preservation, the Historic Hawai Foundation's time, if you can't get everyone on board in the first place with this idea to perpetually conserve or preserve the land or structure.
Sal, do you want to add anything?
No, that's what I would say. Those two things. I would say call TPL or the land trust and get some information, and then get that consensus within the entity. Those are like the two biggest things.
We have a question about the size of parcels, and because of the costs involved, do easements primarily benefit large landowners, or can they also be beneficial to smaller landowners, such as less than 20 acres or so? So if they have ag or conservation values that they want to see protected, is it worth it?
Laura, do you want to take that? Maybe like the Waioli example is a good one, because that's a pretty small property.
Yeah, the Waioli there's two lo'i systems protected. One is really small, just a little square, one particular patch. So that might be our smallest conservation easement, and that in comparison with say Ulupalakua Ranch at over 11,000 acres. And so I wouldn't say that it's not worth it to conserve a small parcel if the resource values are exceptional, and any lo'i, any fish pond, any cultural sites that we still have in Hawaii, we want to protect. So I will say though, on the flip side, just to balance it, it's almost just as much work to preserve 500 acres as it is 1 acre. And so the response, quite frankly, from the land trust might be that, gosh, this is going to be a ton of work, and we're not sure that this is the best use of our limited staff resources to work on such a small property, unless those conservation values are really exceptional.
I'll say from Historic Hawai Foundation's perspective, all of our properties are small. Our largest one is on Maui, and it's 3 acres, and the other 2 are both the TMKs for small urban sites. They're 10,000 square feet. But the values we're preserving are for the historic significance and the architectural values of those sites. And in that case, the scale is not as important as, say, a landscape scale or so forth. But I did see that the Halava Valley Land Trust has an easement on 4 acres. You know, that's not necessarily a huge amount of land, but I'm sure it's very impactful for Halava.
They actually own that land. They don't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Still. So we had a question about who is typically responsible for enforcing against non-conservation use of the land. So if there's an easement on the property and someone is building an unauthorized structure or trespassing or mining, you know, who enforces against that? Is it the conservation easement holder? Is it the property owner? Is it the government? You know, who's in charge there?
Yeah, I can share. So as an accredited land trust, we're actually required to intervene, and where possible, we'll take a softer approach first and have a conversation and see if we can work together with the landowner. In a worst case scenario, we're required to take legal action. And so that's the situation we want to avoid, and we usually do avoid. And I will mention that most conservation easement violations that we've seen, at least in Hawaii, have not been the fault of the landowner. So the landowner typically, you know, the next generation even will want to uphold the values of their parents or grandparents. The issues have been primarily from adjacent properties that are whose use of their lands adversely affects the use of the lands that are preserved with the conservation easement. And so we'll sometimes have to come in. Sometimes there's trespass issues. We've had an issue with a illegally bulldozed road through part of a property conserved with a conservation easement. And so you have these different layers of violation. There might be, you know, it rise to the level of having government involvement. Definitely the landowner has rights to assert in the case of trespass. And then we sometimes need to come in and say, hey, we need to really all address this together in those worst case scenarios. And so how it works and function is we'll try to convene a meeting with the landowner, the landowner's council, you know, us and our council, and ideally with the person or legal entity that's led to the violation of the conservation easement, and just move from there.
I just wanted to talk. Oh, yeah, it's definitely the conservation easement holder, and just in my personal experience, like there's, yeah, we're only like a couple of years into having a conservation easement, and so there's a little bit of a learning curve, and especially amongst ranchers who are, you know, famously sort of independent minded and sort of like just want to do what we want to do to get the job done. So it is something, and you know, our experience has been really great of just working with the conservation easement holder, and we've done some things like we you know, fixed a road, and it was a little bit more than what was sort of written into our conservation easement as something that we could just do. And so we got called out on it, but it was like, okay, like, you know, this is, you should have followed the procedure. And so it was, you know, amicable, but definitely, you know, you can have those little bumps in the process. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good example, because it's not that anyone was acting maliciously or in bad faith. It's just being really sure that everyone's on the same page and being able to work through it. You know, we have more questions. Can you all stay on for just a couple more minutes so that we can answer maybe 1 or 2 more questions before we break? We won't keep you too long, but there's a question that in other jurisdictions, term easements are sometimes used. So instead of being perpetual, they're time limited. And do you have any experiences with those, and are there pros and cons to making them for a certain amount of time and then they end versus a perpetual easement?
Term limited easements don't qualify for the conservation easement tax incentive. They have to be perpetual under the IRS code. But there are programs under USDA that have term limited easements for like wetlands and some other things, pasture land and some other things that are like 10 or 15 years. And you do get compensated. The landowner does get compensated through those programs for, not converting the use of the land to a non-agricultural or wetland use. So I think the landowner just has to weigh the options and weigh the, cost versus the benefits.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. That's helpful. One last question before we do our wrap up, but what role can individuals or nonprofits or community organizations play in catalyzing some of these easements for privately owned land? How can the community really support and encourage the use of this tool?
I mean, I can, chime in here. The community, well, they can raise this as an option with landowners that may be considering converting the use of their land to something the community is opposed to, and ask them to get in touch with one of our organizations. It can also support the different funding sources because, especially when there are hard times like now, we had to, many of the conservation organizations had to spend a lot of capital, really, people capital at the legislature this past session to avert the legislature from abolishing the legacy land conservation program, for example. Folks want to raid those funds for other purposes, and not that those purposes are not, worthy. Yes, there's a great need, but I think those funds were all passed with really bipartisan and huge margins of support, because people in Hawaii want to conserve land and agricultural land and cultural resources and open space and recreational areas. So please support, continuing those funds.
If I could just add, it sometimes is just that one community member. Sometimes it is an attorney or a planner who's familiar with conservation easements and can just mention that this might be an option for a particular landowner. Often in controversial land use situations, the conservation easement or even a conservation purchase in working in partnership with a land trust comes in to really provide that win-win solution where the landowner is fairly compensated, the community gets their open space, their rolling pasture lands, whatever it is that they're interested in protecting. So yeah, thank you all for being here to be that voice.
Oh, there's one thing I did want to mention. We forgot the slide where it said Mahalo Castle Foundation, because there is a community guide to Hawaii land conservation that the Hawaii Land Trust and the Trust for Public Land worked on.
Oh, I'm going to share it, Leah. I'm going to give everyone the link.
That's available on the Historic Hawai website, the links to the PDF. It's a free PDF that you can download, and it has a lot of information for communities and landowners about the conservation process.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's actually a good segue into how you can learn more. And I do thank everyone for staying a few minutes over time. I wish we had more time for discussion, but we will be posting these slides to the Historic Hawai website and as well as the recording. So here are the email addresses for all of us that you can follow up with us. And then just quickly, a couple of other resources. And again, these links are on our website as well, but this is the guide that Leah just mentioned, that Trust for Public Land and Hawaii Land Trust have put together, the community guide to Hawaii land conservation. So it's from all three of our websites at this point. You can download this and Mahalo Castle Foundation. There's also a guide that was put together by the National Park Service on using easements to protect historic properties. And then the standards and practices from the Land Trust Alliance are incredibly useful and highly recommended. I did want to note that we will be continuing our preservation seminars in the fall. We have tentative titles and dates, but watch our e-newsletter for registration information. But we'll be talking about integrating the National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act Section 106 reviews for a coordinated review. So all of you attorneys who work in land use, this might be something that you find useful. And then later in the year, we're going to be looking at some new guidelines and Secretary of Interior standards for historic rehabilitation projects related to flood adaptation. So that'll be really more useful, I think, for the planning community as well as the architectural community, but and also maybe property owners that are in floodplains. I do want to thank everyone for being part of this program and for supporting the programs of Historic Hawai Foundation. As we close out, you're going to get a pop-up with a short course evaluation that we ask you to complete. This really helps us to focus our educational programs and report back to our partners. And there's also going to be a special section at the end specifically for the attorneys who are claiming the CLE credits. So if you do want those credits, please enter your name, your bar association number, and email address. We'll submit that to HSBA and email your certificate of attendance. So I just want to thank everyone for being here with us, being part of our programs, and for all the work you're doing to protect and preserve these really special places in Hawaii. And a very special thank you to Michelle, Laura, and Leah for being our partners today. Mahalo.